Your Bibles, turn with me to Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24. This is a text that we know all very well. We're going to start there in verse number 14. I know we just read 15, and that's the verse that you all know. But we are going to start in verse 14 for some context. In verse 14 it says, "Now, therefore," Joshua speaking, "fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity, in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day who you will serve. Whether the gods of your fathers that they served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." See, in this context, there is a divide among God's people. Some had fallen into idolatry, but Joshua stands up and gives them a sort of ultimatum. You have to pick one. You either have your foot in idolatry or you have your foot with the Lord. You can't go down both sides of the road at the same time. You can't be double-minded, as James says, James 1:8. You've got to make up your mind. "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." For just a moment, I want you to imagine you are one of Joshua's physical children. Can you imagine seeing your father make that stand? And what bravery that took and what leadership that took, that would impress on your mind for years. You remember the time Dad stood up in front of all the people, and it was just him versus the world, but he stood there and laid out his principles. That is important. This morning we're going to talk about the subject of me and my house. And what I mean by that term, me and my house, and what is seen clearly in Joshua 24, is being the godly example within the home that we need to be. You know, in Song of Solomon chapter 1 and verse number 6, he says, "They've made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept." I think it's so easy for us sometimes to speak about the world so much and talk about saving the world through evangelism so much that we lose sight of the fact that evangelism starts within the home. If we are not evangelizing our children, the old adage is if you aren't evangelizing and creating disciples out of your children, then somebody else will. And we need to think very deeply about that matter, about what kind of example we are setting amongst those in our own household. It is unfortunate, but it is the case, that in most American households today, the spiritual leader is no longer the father. In the biblical outline that we have time and time again, the father, just like Joshua in Joshua 24, is called to be the spiritual head of the household. But that is not the case. By and large, women are a lot more religious and a lot more godly-minded than men are. We've lost that aspect of the in-house evangelism, the father figure. We need to work on that. Us fathers who are Christians, we need to do a better job at stepping up and putting out the example for our children, for our wife, and for all those around us that we will serve the Lord. As for me and my house. You say, well, why is it that important? I'm not against church, but you know, what difference does it make? Did you know that statistically speaking, and it's hard to nail down an exact number, but statistically speaking, a child who is raised in a church-going home, a child who is raised around greater Christendom, is 20 to 50, that's why I said it's hard to nail down an exact number, 20 to 50% less likely to get caught up in drugs and the legal system. 20 to 50. That is a real statistic that is shocking. There are other statistics that are kind of hard to nail down an exact number, but by and large, if a child is raised in a God-fearing home, attending services and observing the Lord's commands, they are less likely to be involved in drug activity and crime. They are more likely to have better academic achievements. There's all sorts of psychological, secular reasons why church is good for the family. We have plenty of spiritual reasons. Obviously, number one, first and foremost, is saving your children's soul. But aside from that, there's nothing bad about having a God-fearing home. It's something we need to work on and think very deeply about. Very deeply about. This morning, let's consider a few points on this topic of me and my house. Number one, let's go to the next slide there. We need to start simple. I know sometimes we can get overwhelmed with, all that is in Scripture and, okay, it's written in different languages. How much do I need to know before I start teaching? You don't have to start with the Hebrew. You don't have to start going into Koine Greek and explaining all the different, tenses of Greek. That's not where it starts. It starts very simple. On Wednesday nights when we have the kids up here, the little kids, and they're singing songs, and that's where it starts. Just sitting down with your children and being able to talk about who God is, who Jesus is, what He has done for us. It can start as simple as just learning the books of the Bible. You'd be surprised how many people don't even know the books of the Bible. When I went to preaching school, and I'm sure others that went to preaching school have experienced the same thing, the first assignment we had in preaching school was to sit down and write the books of the Bible in order spelled correctly. And everybody's like, oh, easy. And then you have to pass your test to somebody else, and they grade it. And I got someone else's test, and they put down 3 Peter. That's not in there. That's just not in there. It starts simple. You don't have to start with the deepest parts. You start with the shallow end. But we need to be doing that with our children. That's the idea behind this read-along program that we've been doing, is that you can just sit down with your kids in the evening and just read. Read to them. And you know what? Kids are rambunctious. I have a 5-year-old. I have a 1.5-year-old. I know it's hard to get them to sit still. Put them in a headlock and read the Bible. All right, let's consider some verses. Let's move to the next slide. Don't put your kids in a headlock. Joshua chapter 4. And this is a text we've gone over several times. And we've actually gone over this in our reading a couple weeks ago. Andy did a really good lesson on the first week when we had the read-along program, and he used Joshua 4 in that. Joshua 4, 21 and 22, he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, what do these stones mean? Okay, what are the context? Well, the people had just walked across the Jordan River that the Lord had dried up, just like the Red Sea. And so they were going to take 12 stones out of the riverbed, and they were going to make a memorial. Okay, that's very deep, and it signifies a lot of things. We could get into the topic of holy numbers and what that means, and he didn't say that. He said when your kids see these stones and they say, what does that mean? Well, just simply say to them, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. And the very next verse talks about how he relates that to the Red Sea crossing. That's just a simple thing. It's a visual aid to help teach your kids. Now, there was obviously deeper significance behind this, but when we're teaching our children, we can start with the small stuff. We don't have to start in the deep end. We can start in the shallow end. Very next slide, please. In Psalm chapter 90, verses 16 and 17, let your work be shown to your servants and your glorious power to their children. And let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. The very first part of verse 16 I want you to focus in on. Let your work be shown to your servants. Okay, if you don't know the Old Testament biblical language, the Hebrew, if you don't know Aramaic, if you don't know Greek, that's okay. That's all right, because all you need to know is what did God do for you. That's what Psalm 90 is suggesting. Tell people what God has done for you, okay? See the glorious power and the favor of the Lord. Can you tell your children about what He has done in your life? Sure you can. One of my favorite quotes on evangelism comes from Andrew Conley. And I don't remember the quote word for word, line for line, but it was along the lines of, I do not have to have a degree in biblical languages. I do not have to be able to sit down and proficiently write a commentary and be able to explain all the deepest parts. But if I have a tongue and the ability to speak, I can tell somebody about what Jesus did for me. And it's as simple as that. And that starts, again, we need to be focused on the world. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that we take time out of the world, but it starts with the home. If you're not evangelizing your children, then how would you evangelize the world? For years here at Arnold, as we go on these teen campaigns, we've always had the rule that you need to be a Christian before you go on a teen campaign, because part of the teen campaigns we go on are evangelism, evangelistic in framework. And if you have not become a Christian yourself, why would you be able to convert someone else? Okay, if you haven't converted your own house, then how do you expect to go and save the world? Same thought process. So we need to start simple with our children. Let's look at the next point here. We need to lead by example, lead the way. We need to be the one that they look to for spiritual guidance. Okay, again, it's not something I enjoy talking about, but it is the case that a lot of times in the family, that the men that are called to be the spiritual leaders have failed in a lot of places. And I don't say that with any amount of joy. And how we need to certainly pat the mothers on the back for being there and carrying the load that they are not required to carry full force. We need to applaud them for that. However, we also need to, as men, step up and do a better job. And I'm talking not just about men who are not Christians and looking towards becoming a Christian, but I'm talking about Christian men. They need to step up and lead the way, lead by example. Consider a few things here with me. In Joshua chapter 24. Now we're going to look at two different parts of this. Okay, so we read a little bit out of Joshua 24. I want you to drop down to verse 31, and then we're going to go to Judges chapter 2. And I want you to notice these two things compared. Israel, after hearing that great stance that Joshua took, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay, and Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known the works. Keep that in your mind. The ones that had known the works that the Lord did for Israel. Now consider Judges chapter 2, verses 7 and 10. All the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen, okay, back in Joshua 24, it said had known. Judges chapter 2, the ones that had seen the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Okay, and then between verses 7, so verses 8 and 9, Joshua passes away. So we're fast forwarding when we go down to verse 10, and it says, and all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, including Joshua. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord. They did not know the Lord or the work that He had done for Israel. Are you following what's going on? Do you see the breakdown? Between Joshua and those who lived in his generation, they were serving the Lord. But then there is a clear breakdown in communication between this generation in verse 7 and that generation in verse 10. They failed in some point to explain to their children what God had done for Israel. They dropped the ball. And that's all it takes. You have to understand how fragile the religious fabric in this country especially, but in the world overall is. All it takes is one generation. You don't have to sit there and indoctrinate your children with the doctrine of the world. You just simply have to not bring up Christ. That's all it takes. It's just simply not talking about it. That's how simple it can be to completely derail a whole generation of children from the truth of the gospel. So Joshua was the great example. He stood up in Joshua 24:15. He made a great stance. People followed him. And then once that generation died off, there arose another generation. They did not know anything about it. It's not like they went out of their way to forget. It's just that they weren't taught. According to this text, there's no teaching. They did not know what the Lord had done for Israel. That's why it is so important for us as Christian parents, as adults, even if you don't have children, this lesson still applies to you because you teach all around you. Older women are supposed to teach the younger women. Older men are supposed to help teach the younger men. It is your job as a Christian to teach the generation that is to come after you. And I know that in my generation, the millennials, we had a fall off in millennial interest, I feel like, in God overall. But I'm seeing a lot of change in some of the younger generations. They're interested in religion. That seems to be the trend. Now, it is our duty to point them in the right direction, because an interest without knowledge is not much of anything. You know, Romans chapter 10, the great evangelistic framework of Romans 10, you know, my prayer to God and heart's desire is for Israel that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. And I feel like this new upcoming 2 generations are there. They have the zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. It is your job as an adult, as a mature Christian, to impart the knowledge, to match the zeal. So be there for the younger generation and lead by example. We need strong men and strong women to stand up and to point people in the right direction by their actions. You know, Paul said, follow me as long as I follow Christ. That should be our goal. We should be leading the charge from the front. Okay, the last thing I want to point out here is that we need to leave a legacy. Okay, we need to start simple, start with the small things, you know, try to impart the little things to our children. Number 2, we need to lead the way, lead by example. And number 3, we need to leave a legacy. If handled correctly, if done properly, when you are dead and gone, and we will all get there eventually, hopefully your children and your children's children will be able to look at your example and know right from wrong by the way you carried yourself, by the things you said, by the way you treated others, by the way you spent time with your God, by your study habits, by the way that you used to pray when sitting around the dinner table. They will look at your example and they will remember that. You know, sometimes it gets so easy to feel discouraged and to feel like our example doesn't really matter that much. And what can I do? I'm just one person. You know, and I've told this story before, but I want to share it with you again. In the early 1970s, back before when Doves Cry came on the radio, in the early 1970s in northwest Georgia, there was a young preacher who had set up a Bible study with a young couple. This young couple had 3 children. They went through a program. I think it was the Joel Miller film strips. Don't quote me on that, but it was a program where they sat down and studied the Bible together, and that couple was baptized into Christ. A couple of months later, that same preacher had set up another Bible study and asked this new couple to attend this Bible study with him. So couple number 1 and this young preacher go to couple number 2's house. They have 2 young children, and they teach them the gospel, and that led to them being baptized into Christ. Now, the craziest thing about this entire story is that the first couple was my dad's parents, and the second couple was my mom's parents. And they did not live in the same town. They lived about an hour apart. And they didn't know each other from Adam, but my dad's parents, when they were new Christians, were asked to go and attend a Bible study and help out with the Bible study of another couple that would eventually become Christians. And then years later, 20 years down the road, those 2 children from those 2 couples would marry, and that's my parents. Now, my grandfather on my mother's side did know a little bit about the church, but he had not really paid that much attention to it. All my other grandparents were new to the idea of the church. Yet it was through one person's example, one person, that both sides of my family found God. And through that, you talk about all the children that they've had and their children's children, and all that started with one little seed. So you might be sitting here thinking, well, you know, I can't guarantee that my kids are going to be faithful. I can't guarantee that I can impart wisdom to the young people in the church and it's going to matter. You can't guarantee it. But I can guarantee if you don't try, I know what happens. There comes another generation that does not know the Lord. So please don't think so so small. Expand your mind a little bit. Don't think so confined. We have to understand that it's not about us. It's not about what I bring to the table and how great I am. It's not about leaving a legacy so that people look at us and think, oh, they were so good, they were the best person I know. That's not what it's about. But it's about leaving that spiritual example, that ripple effect, that pebble thrown into the water that ripples for, way, way, way out into the lake. That's what I'm talking about. Leave a spiritual legacy where people can point to you and say, I know they were doing what's right, and I'm going to try to imitate them in that way. 2 verses, and then the lesson will be yours. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse number 5. A text that we know pretty well. I'm reminded, Paul says, of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in who? In your grandmother Lois. Okay, she would then impart that same spiritual example into his mother, Eunice. And now I am sure it dwells in you as well. You can back it up and you can see where the example started with the grandmother and how that was passed down to the daughter and how that was passed down to the son. And then you think about how many people Timothy was able to share the gospel with. You see the ripple effect. And it all started with one place, the grandmother Lois. Another text that I will leave you with, next slide please. Psalm chapter 78 verses 4 and drop down to verse number 6. We will not hide from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and His might and His wonders that He has done, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn. Watch this last part. The children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children. I want nothing more in the wake of my existence, in the wake of your existence, for our examples to sound through eternity. In our children, in our grandchildren, and for maybe even the great and great-great-grandchildren that you never meet. You want your example to speak louder as eternity goes on. Please understand, I'm not trying to be too harsh by criticizing our effort, but understand that we need to work on it. We need to do better. We need to stand up just like Joshua did and say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It starts with you. It starts with you. Something that Andy mentioned a couple weeks ago, you cannot impart something in which you do not have. You can't leave your children $1 million inheritance if you don't first have $1 million to leave, right? So this morning I'm asking you, if you are not where you need to be spiritually, why not change that today? So you can walk out of here knowing that you can impart spiritual knowledge to your children because you're on the right page with God. If you are a child of God already and you haven't been doing what you need to do, make it right today. I don't know why people are scared to confront fault. We're not saying you're an evil person just because you have fault. Everybody, all have fallen short of the glory of God. All have sinned. I think the better example is having a man or a woman stand up and being willing to admit that, to have an honest heart. So search your heart this morning. If you need the prayers of the church, we'd love to help you. If you are not a child of God, we would love to sit down with you and talk to you about what it means to become a child of God. And we would love to show everybody here what that looks like. Whatever your need may be, why don't you come and stand as we sing the song of invitation.